All right, everybody, I am going to put up a video lecture. This is for Plymouth State Medieval Me classes because of canceled class day, just to make sure we don't fall too far behind the syllabus. What we're going to do is talk about High Medieval Europe a little bit here and get that on our radar for what's going on in the Middle Ages, part of our first couple weeks of survey, catching up on the general things going on in the Middle Ages. So, High Medieval Europe. Last time we talked about early medieval Europe. That's that transition out of the Roman Empire with all the changes to society we talked about. Charlemagne and his empire with the Frankish kingdom becoming the largest of all these post-Roman kingdoms. Charlemagne himself becoming Emperor of the Romans by the Pope's decision on Christmas Day 800. Also the era of Vikings and all this kind of thing going on. And coming to an end around the year 1000, right? The early Middle Ages were that period from about 500 AD to about 1000 AD. So the High Middle Ages are going to be the next phase. That's from about 1000 down to 1300, and that's what we're going to talk about now. To get into the High Middle Ages a little bit, one thing is that we need to understand the Carolingian Empire, the empire that Charlemagne built, did not last. It broke up. The empire was partitioned between his grandsons so that you had a Western Frankish kingdom that's going to become the basis of modern France. There was an Eastern Frankish kingdom, roughly corresponding to Germany. There was a Middle Kingdom that was rooted on Italy, and then a strip of land up through the center of Europe, up to the Low Countries, where Belgium and the Netherlands are now. There were civil wars going on, there was a lot of conflict going on, and the result is you no longer had one big empire anymore, you had these various kingdoms, and even within each kingdom, the kings were weaker as far as their ability to control the nobles than Charlemagne had been. They had to try to win over the support of the noblemen, which of the various grandsons of Charlemagne was a noble family going to support, and in order to win that support, to go with oneself instead of your rivals, you had to offer the nobles different things. And what wound up happening was the nobles got a lot more power, and the kings wound up having less resources with which they could really control and overpower the nobles. So your high medieval kings is really the low point of kingship. It's the low point of central government. Kings are still powerful, but their material resources, the actual wealth that they can dispose of, the number of troops that they have, is really not any greater than the great noblemen's. A major counter-duke would have just as much wealth, just as many troops he could put in the field, just as many castles or population or what have you, as a king would have. Kings had ceremony, they had the crown, they had the throne, and that was not nothing. But there weren't a lot of governing institutions left that would allow them to really impose their will on the various regional noblemen. And this is going to sort of set the tone for a lot of what happens over the next few hundred years, these time period between 1000 and 1300. So not going to try and describe all the various events that happened, politically or battles-wise or anything, but instead sort of look at different sectors of high medieval society and some of the major developments going on in them. First of all, let's look at the nobility, the secular nobility, your dukes, your counts, your barons, and so forth, still carrying on as the early medieval nobility had been. They're still preoccupied with land. They're still preoccupied with their networks of relationships among their kin, their various family members. They're still a warrior class with all the concerns there, so that much hasn't changed. The big story in the high medieval nobility is really the rise of knighthood as the major sort of cultural form. You had warriors earlier, but they weren't knights until the High Middle Ages. What's going on here is these noblemen, as they're becoming more powerful and having political agendas of their own, they're needing to build followings of other warriors, noble-born warriors, but lower in status than themselves. You've got your high nobles, your dukes and counts and so forth, and then you've got the sort of poorer, weaker nobles, the guys who only have a single village, or maybe just half a village or a fraction of a village under their control. They're not peasants, they're wealthy, they're landholding, they're warrior class and all that, but they're not really super wealthy, incredibly powerful people like the great dukes and counts are, who have entire, vast lands under their jurisdiction. So they're sort of drawing on the sons of these poorer, smaller scale nobles and recruiting them to come live in their castles, eat at their table. They'll give them clothing and armor and weapons and all the necessities of life in exchange for their loyalty. And these often young, generally poorer nobles at the castles of the really powerful nobles sort of come to have a strong sense of group identity. In German, there's the word Knecht, K-N-E-C-H-T. It means a serving boy. And that kind of English is a Germanic language, and that word Knecht comes over to English, the Knechts. English is a language you use to pronounce every single letter of, but this sort of band of lower status, men hanging around, not real servants, but sort of hanging around at lower status than the actual noble family ruling the castle. So this is where English gets its word knight from. Later on in the English language, the consonants go silent, the K and the G and so forth, and the Knechts become knights. There's a stage of developments. The knights are a very ambitious group of people, right? They're coming from the poorer classes. They're trying to win more land, win more honor, win more status through their service. So they're very competitive. They're all trying to stand out as who is the best knight, who is the best one that the Lord is going to want to reward. Excuse me. And so they're looking for ways to impress him, right? So you have this initial set of values for what makes a great knight that kind of revolves around your basic warrior values. Do you have prowess? That means your fighting ability in battle. Do you have bravery? Do you have loyalty? Do you have these sort of fundamental characteristics that you want, the soldiers want to have so that they stand out as sort of the key individuals in the duchy or in the county, so that if they impress their duke fighting for him in his local fights against other dukes and counts and such, the duke will decide to reward this guy with lands, with putting him in charge of guarding one of the smaller castles of his own, maybe give him the hand of an heiress, if there's some family around that's died without a male heir. That's a great way to get yourself some property, is marry an heiress. Sort of all these things are hoping to get rewarded with land and wealth somehow, but you got to stand out to do it. So far, so good. So you got these various noblemen fighting amongst themselves. King can't really do much to stop them. They're gathering bands of knights and they're charging around, attacking each other's castles and burning each other's villages and all this. And the knights are sort of finding ways to try to rise up the ladder by serving their lords this way. The group that's going to have a big problem with this is going to be the church. Remember, the churches are very much entangled with the interests of the noble families, right? Their members come from noble families donate to them, and so forth. And so a lot of times when these noble families go to war with each other, they wind up catching churches in the crossfire, right? You'll wind up burning peasant villages, which, are on church property, and assaulting church personnel that come from one of the noble families, that kind of a thing. So the church gets very concerned about all this. Normally, in Charlemagne's time, you would have told the king, complained to him, and the king would have come in with a heavy hand and, crack down on people, knock some heads together, and impose some law and order. But the kings are weak now. Kings aren't really able to do very much to stop this fighting amongst the noblemen as they're pursuing their different agendas. So the church decides it has to take matters into its own hand. Certain churches launch a movement called the Peace of God, where the idea is to hold a church council, something that had been happening for a long time anyway. These councils will be held on a regular basis to deal with church business. And you bring the relics of your saints, the remains of the saints, the bones of the saints, which sort of have this mystical presence to them, this miraculous power. And you invite the local noblemen and knights to come and attend the council, and they can visit the saints, which is a very big religious thing to do. And then while they're there, you tell them the saints want you to swear an oath. And they want you to swear an oath that you're not going to attack churches, you're not going to attack priests and monks and nuns, you're going to leave women alone, you're going to leave the peasants alone. If you have to fight, we don't really want you Christians fighting amongst yourselves, but if you have to fight, you're going to have to, just do it amongst yourselves, among warriors. And sort of take this oath, the peace oath, to sort of protect these things rather than ravaging them. And this catches on fairly well, becomes a fairly popular idea. It doesn't end war, but it's one of the world's first peace movements, and it does a lot to start restraining private noble violence among members of the noble class. This starts making the task of being a knight a little more complicated. It's not just enough to be a great warrior anymore with your bravery and your loyalty and your prowess. Now you also need to be pious. You also need to be a servant of the church. You also need to be a protector of the innocent and of the spiritual and such. So this is sort of the beginning of a major shift. And the first piece of councils are being called like the 980s, early 1000s. And then in 1095 AD, you get another whole new thing that's going to add to this dimension of religious knighthood. You may remember in the east of Europe, you have this Byzantine Empire, this Eastern Roman Empire, which has a frontier with the rising Muslim world, and the Byzantines and the various Muslim groups have been fighting wars for a while. In the 11th century, after it had been going pretty well for the Byzantines, it starts going badly again. A new group called the Turks shows up, starts attacking them, and the Byzantines start losing battles and losing land to the Turks. So they write to their main contact in Western Europe, the Pope, and say, can you arrange for, some soldiers to come over here, beef up our armies a little bit and help us fight the Turks? The popes are in the middle of a big political struggle at the time, so the idea kind of gets put on the back burner for a few years, but eventually sort of catches the attention of a pope named Urban II in the 1090s. But he takes the idea and it sparks his imagination and he runs with it in a whole new direction. He gathers a peace council at a place called Clermont in France and says to the knights at Clermont, A, I want you to swear the peace oath, sort of fairly routine stuff there. But B, I also want to call something to your attention, which is that the Christians of the East are getting attacked by Muslims and you need to go to their rescue. And not only, it's going to go above and beyond what the Byzantine Emperor asked for, not only do I want you to go to the rescue of the Christians of the East, I want you to go all the way to Jerusalem, right? Christ is our king. Christ the king wore the crown of thorns in Jerusalem, the crown of thorns in Jerusalem, sorry. It's not right that his city should be in the hands of these infidel Muslims. Why should that be? And so he calls what later historians will refer to as the First Crusade. This sparks a huge degree of excitement. Just really strikes a chord with these knights. They've been told, don't fight other Christians, do all this ravaging and raiding and burning and pillaging you're doing is a bad thing. If you're supposed to be a Christian knight and not go shedding the blood of other Christians, what are you supposed to do? You're still a warrior class. Well, now we got somebody who can fight. Go fight the Muslim warriors and head off over there. So the knights respond to this. You get a First Crusade setting out in 1096. Surprising series of military successes and makes it all the way to Jerusalem and captures it in 1099. And you actually wind up with some Crusader principalities being set up around Jerusalem and some other lands on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. The Muslim world at the time is divided between various warlords of its own. They fight back one by one, bit by bit, start carving off land from these Crusader principalities. More crusades get called to try and rescue them or redeem the situation. They generally fail. After the First Crusade, most of them are pretty much military disasters. And then in 1291, the last bit of Crusader land in the Middle East is finally captured by Muslims, and Jerusalem is gone, and that's pretty much the end of Middle Eastern crusading. The crusade idea is going to last for a long time afterwards, but there's no more actual Middle Eastern successful campaigns going on after the 1290s. So that kind of fits actually from 1095 to 1291 very neatly into the High Middle Ages. It's the age of Middle Eastern crusading. One of the things with crusading, which is worth talking about, which is sort of how to understand in the big picture. On the one hand, one should be aware that both Christian Europe and the Muslim Middle East are hierarchical societies dominated by a warrior class. They're both the same way. The Muslims also have their sort of, their warrior elites who also fight among themselves, Muslim versus Muslim. And that's one thing to bear in mind. There's a lot of sort of ideological hay that gets made out of the Crusades in modern times. Some people treat it as this sort of unprovoked Christian aggression against a Muslim Middle East that just sort of is this victim that suffers this attack they didn't deserve. Other people try to cast it as, well, the Muslim world was invading Christian land and expanding there, so Christianity fights back and is the defensive war. Both of those ideas are complete nonsense. They make no sense at all. Up until that moment, there had been no one united idea of Christendom that could fight a war. It's not like there's the land of Christendom and the land of Islam, and the two of them had been at war for centuries. It wasn't like that at all. Jerusalem had been in Muslim hands for 400 years. It wasn't as though this was some recent thing that was being set right. The Muslims have been there longer than people of European descent have been in the Americas. Hundreds and hundreds of years. This was sort of the normal situation there. And as far as the sort of overall violence, both societies were violent warrior societies. Plenty of wars got fought within Europe. Plenty of wars got fought within the Middle East. warrior versus warrior. All the Crusades really did was to kind of reshuffle the deck of which warriors were fighting whom. Right, instead of the Christian warriors fighting Christian warriors, the Muslims were fighting other Muslims. You had a few campaigns, about one a generation or so. As decades would go by between one crusade and the next. Once a generation or so, you'd get a war where some Christians would go fight some Muslims. It wasn't a really big increase or a big shift in the overall amount of war or violence going on in either society. It was just sort of a unique, kind of a blip in the way that overall warfare worked. So whenever people try to make this ideological message out of the Crusades, be aware it's generally nonsense. They are significant in a lot of levels, but not as some sort of clash of civilizations in either direction where you can try and figure out who's to blame more. It's just two warrior societies, warriors fight. They go to war. It's what they do. So anyway, that's on that issue. The other thing about the Crusades that's worth mentioning is the issue of the motivations that knights had for going on crusades and other people. Were they really going for religious reasons? Were they sincere? Or was it just sort of for, greed and plunder and aggression that way? And that's in some ways a tough question to answer because, of course, thousands and thousands of people went on crusades and they all had their own motivations. Some of them were greedy and ambitious and out to conquer land. Others probably were, genuinely pious and genuinely believing in the religious value of what they were doing. One thing that's been pointed out in some of the more recent scholarship has been that you had an awful lot of people going on crusade who already were wealthy elites in European society, who often sold off their lands or mortgaged their lands, went into debt in order to undertake this very risky expedition, put their lives at risk, and then after they got to Jerusalem, if they made it there at all, fulfilled their vow, fought some battles, visited the holy places, and then went home to try and work on paying off those debts. They didn't stay to conquer lands or, gather huge amounts of plunder. They went to a lot of expense and a lot of sacrifice for not much motivation for material gain. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Crusader kingdom that was established, had a perpetual problem trying to get people to stay, to defend it, not just to fight the one battle and go home, but to actually stick around and defend them long-term against the Muslim neighbors, and it was very, very difficult to get people to do that. So again, some people certainly were, corrupt and greedy and ambitious and aggressive and whatever. Other people seem to have, probably many people, maybe the majority, seem to have actually believed that there was some kind of a spiritual benefit to what they're doing. And I don't have time to go into what those benefits were, but, they did believe in it. Okay, so anyway, between the peace of God and the Crusades, knighthood has now turned into something rather unique and different, right? You now have a Christian knighthood. This idea, a knight is not just a brave and loyal and tough warrior, but he's also a Christian. He fights for God. He fights for higher purposes, a higher justice or higher spirituality. He defends the poor and the helpless, right? Something that's not necessarily assumed of all warrior classes. So that's a big shift in the notion of what constitutes proper knighthood or what makes for the best knight. Going on crusade becomes part of your resume, so to speak, sort of part of the profile of how you claim, look how great a knight I am. Okay, third thing, peacetime. You don't have wars going on all the time. If you're an ambitious knight trying to stand out and distinguish yourself as the best of them all so that your lord will reward you with castles and lands and heiresses, peacetime sucks, right? No way to show people how you're the best, no way to, stand out. So here, what the knights start doing is they start finding other ways to compete and stand out other than fighting wars. One thing you could do is if you don't have a real war going on, you fight a fake one. It's called a tournament, where the early tournaments, this is probably the 12th century, the 1100s, you'll mark off a field, big, wide area, might be a mile or more, it might be a village and forest and things in the middle of it, but you mark it off and you get teams of knights from different counties and duchies on different sides of it. They get blunt weapons rather than sharp ones, and they charge across the field at each other as though they were having a battle, trying to knock each other off their horses and take each other prisoner and stuff like that, just like they would in a real war. Like I say, not with sharp weapons. They're not trying to kill each other. Accidents do happen. We usually get records of these tournaments when somebody does die in them because it is a pretty rough sport, so to speak. But this is a way you could sort of show off what a great warrior you as, even though there's no war going on, and it can even be pretty profitable. There are usually prizes for the winners. If you capture a rival knight, you can, depending on the rules of the particular tournament, you might get to keep his horse and his armor, which is a very expensive pack of gear. You might be able to hold him for ransom, just as though you had captured him in a real war, things like that. So there's actually a way you can kind of make your reputation and make some money while waiting for a real war to break out that you can fight in. So you get the tournaments, and then there's a whole other thing, which is the rise of courtly love. You can compete not in battle, but compete for the hearts of the ladies, so to speak. And you get this development of a whole culture of courtly love. It's drawing on roots that go back to ancient Rome. It's drawing on poetic things coming out of Spain and a whole bunch of other stuff. King Arthur literature comes out as associated with all this. But the idea that the knight is not just a warrior and not just a Christian warrior, but the knight's a lover. The knight is civilized, the knight is elegant, the knight appreciates, maybe writes poetry and music, he dresses well, he speaks well and eloquently, and these kinds of things. And this sort of development of courtliness, in French they call it courtoisie, which is where we get the word courtesy from, becomes a whole code of conduct where you're trying to act in a way that will impress the ladies of the court, right? So that will also impress the lord of the court, and, again, cause you to have a reputation as the best knight. Courtly love rarely has anything to do with marriage. As a matter of fact, a lot of the writers of it presume that marriage is something that gets arranged for property purposes. Marriage is a business transaction, and courtly love is going to be, with some other lady. You're going to be focusing your attention on some other ladies. Actually consummating the relationship with the lady is not required. What's required is that the knight prove his nobility of spirit and his civilized character, his courtoisie, by his acts of devotion to her, right? Since noble women generally marry very young, chances are any candidate lady is going to already be married, so courtly love is often sort of frankly adulterous in its character. It's, devoting your love to some lady who is already married. And as a matter of fact, the more unattainable she is, the better, right? Because that sort of proves your spirit, it proves how devoted and how determined you are, that even though there's no hope you're ever going to, get consummation in this relationship, nevertheless, you're still going to keep on devoting yourself, and that sort of shows your chivalrous heart and, sort of what a great spirit you are, and that's a way to stand out. So courtly love becomes this whole other thing. Okay, so this is the culture of the nobility. Knighthood starts off in the lower, poorer ranks of the nobility, but through the rise of crusading and through courtly love, eventually becomes very prestigious and becomes fashionable and becomes something that the highest nobles want to be knights too, and knighthood sort of becomes the defining ethos of the European noble class in the High Middle Ages, so very, very important that way. Okay, so that's developments on the noble side, right, thinking that way. Developments in other areas of society, and I don't want to take too long with all these, but let's look at the church, right? We said beforehand, you've got your secular church with your priests and your bishops and ultimately the Pope, which we want to talk about especially here. And then you've got the regular church, that's your regulated church, the monasteries and nunneries and so forth. That Christian urge to reform, to criticism and reform I spoke about, really has a lot of traction in the monasteries in the High Middle Ages. There's a lot of concern that they're not being appropriately self-denying, they're not being sufficiently spiritual in the monasteries, and you get waves of reform movements. Always new types of monks, new orders of monasteries, trying to get the monastic life right. I'll deal with them very briefly. In the 900s and early 1000s, you get the Cluniacs from a monastery called Cluny, C-L-U-N-Y, who basically focus on the liturgy, the sort of public prayers and worship services, and aim at political independence, not being under the control of kings or nobles, right? So sort of political independence so they can focus on the spiritual exercises is the idea of Cluny. A century later, about the 1090s, you get the monastery of Citeaux in northern France, becomes the basis of an order called the Cistercians, who, like Cluniac independence, but they're also arguing you need to also disentangle yourself from wealth. The Cistercians like to have their monasteries, in swamps and forests and places like that, so they could live a life of greater hardship and manual labor because they feel that that's a key to spirituality. And then later still, early 1200s, you get groups of the mendicant orders. These are Franciscans and Dominicans who take the idea of the Cistercian poverty and hardship, but they go even further. They say they don't want any property at all, They don't even want to have a monastery. They want to live in the street and go around preaching to people and live on people's, charity to them. That has to get compromised on for practical reasons eventually, but this idea of being, living for spiritual poverty and being out in the street doing works of charity and preaching, that becomes, very, very popular, especially with the rise of towns and a merchant class, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So the monasteries have all these reform movements going on, and they start spilling over into the secular church as well. People start asking, how can the secular church become more spiritual? There's especially concern with a problem they call simony, which is the buying and selling of church offices, right? People sort of bribing their way into becoming a priest or a bishop or something like that. And a key development here is, in order to try to deal with cases of simony, you need someone with the authority, with the jurisdiction, to punish simoniacs, to remove a bishop from his office. And so what results is an elevation in the status of the Pope, right? The Pope before this had been Bishop of Rome. He's, very, very big, important bishop. Everybody kind of agrees he's, a patriarch and a very big deal among bishops. But he didn't actually have any practical authority over other bishops. He was just sort of the biggest, of all the bishops. But now with the idea of wanting to take on simony, church reformers start saying the Pope needs to have jurisdiction. The Pope needs to be above and beyond an ordinary bishop so that the Pope can pass judgment on bishops, and if they've been committing simony or some other sin, the Pope could discipline them and punish them and remove them from their offices and this kind of stuff. So the Pope's rise to, or at least the claims of the Pope's power, get to be ever more elevated, and this is kind of what makes the papacy, as it's thought of in Roman Catholicism today, as sort of the Pope is the head of the church, sort of a different kind of a role for him there. That's going to get the popes into conflict with secular authorities. You've got kings and the Holy Roman Emperor up in Germany, who are used to appointing bishops for their own purposes, political purposes, frankly, because the bishops are, powerful, influential individuals. The Pope starts saying, no, you can't do that. Only the Pope is supposed to be able to appoint a bishop. This leads to a huge political struggle. That's what I was referring to earlier when I mentioned, the popes are kind of preoccupied and not able to respond to the Byzantines' requests for aid. They're dealing with a big controversy with the German emperors at the time, and that's taking up all their authority. And one thing that this controversy brings out, it's called the investiture controversy in the about 1070s, goes on down to the early 1100s, is that the emperors can push back hard. They've got their own churches, they've got their own bishops, they've got their own theologians who are perfectly happy to write letters and write theological treatises explaining why the Pope is wrong, and why the Pope is a heretic, and why the Pope is demanding too much power here. And when push comes to shove, the emperor can even march an army down to Rome and kick the Pope out into exile and, take over. So like I was mentioning when I was doing a little bit of myth-busting about religion in the Middle Ages, yes, the church is hugely powerful. Yes, the church is hugely influential. Yes, popes are very, very important. But that doesn't mean popes just dictate what everybody else does and everybody else just has to obey them. You have divisions within the church where they argue amongst themselves, including against popes. You have kings and emperors who can push back against popes if they're not wanting to cooperate with what the pope is trying to make them do. This is much more the realm of questions people argue about, not, the one thing that everybody obeys and is on the same page about. Okay, so that's on the religion side, kind of briefly. Another thing related to that is the rise of scholasticism. You may remember that Charlemagne, back in the Carolingian Renaissance, had required churches to establish schools. His empire breaks up, but those schools are still around. And as we get in the High Middle Ages, they're growing, they're getting bigger, they're getting more sophisticated, more students going, more professors, and you get the growth of sort of a new intellectual culture called scholasticism, devoted to the exercise of logic and applying logical methods to all sorts of philosophical, medical, legal, and theological questions, right? I wish I had time to talk about scholasticism. I don't, because I don't want this to go on too long, but what had been the schools attached to monasteries and cathedrals in Charlemagne's time, by the early 1200s, are turning into universities. They're becoming institutions of their own. They're still linked to the church, but they're really taking on a life of their own and pursuing all these questions, studying, as I said, medicine, law, philosophy, theology, other topics, and becoming extraordinarily sophisticated, really debating a lot the relationship between, faith and reason, and sort of redeveloping philosophy and theology along those lines. So big development there. I wish I had more time for it. Okay. So that was dealing with the nobles, that was dealing with the church. The other thing I want to deal with is commoners. Peasants, we won't worry about too much. Peasants are going on being peasants as they had. But the real story for the High Middle Ages is the emergence of a middle class. The early Middle Ages did not have much of a class. There were merchants around, but not enough of them to really sort of form a major group in society that you could call a social class of its own standing. That starts to change. It's becoming an increasingly prosperous society. There's a little bit of natural global warming going on that's causing there to be more agricultural growth and prosperity. The population is growing. Places like Italy, in particular, that are sort of on the sea and connected to the Eastern Mediterranean already for some political and historical reasons. You get merchants going to the Middle East and they're buying silks and spices and ivory and all these luxury goods that are coming from Asia and from Africa, shipping it across the Mediterranean and then going overland into France and Germany and Spain and England and selling these things. You get these whole trade networks growing. And along with the trade networks growing, you also get the growth of towns again. Remember, when the Roman Empire broke up, towns had shrunk and some of them had disappeared entirely. Well, now you get new towns emerging, right, sort of as the marketplaces of the trade. They're not being created the way the Romans did for political purposes to control things. They're being created for economic purposes. So they're more organic. They're more, sort of a stable outgrowth of economies as they sort of build up around these hubs of trade. And the key thing about them is they're able to get themselves charters from the kings of what's called a communal status or communal privileges or communal freedoms. They become communes, which is not in the sense of communism, nothing to do with, hippies in Northern California having a commune, but commune in the sense of a self-governing town, right? The merchants of the town, the nobles who own land in the town, will form a city council. They'll get to set up their own court, maybe mint their own currency, build walls, put up a guard, all these sort of functions of government over against the claims of, what otherwise would have been, noble rulers. So these communes are sort of a new feature in the landscape, funneling trade and taking on a political role in agenda of their own. Along with that, you're going to get some other things happening. You're going to get the rise of banking. You had money lending beforehand, had largely been relegated to Jews. And again, for time reason, I won't go too much into it. I'll go into it a little bit. Because landowning was associated with lordship, right? Owning land means you sort of control the peasants who are on it. As Christianization proceeded and you had a more and more Christian society, Christian authorities started getting nervous about the idea of Jews owning land, right? They're not Christian. You've got sort of a long-standing religious antipathy between Christians and Jews, to put it mildly. And the idea that you could have a Jewish lord who's going to have political influence, who's going to have peasants under his control that he might influence by his religion, that was something that a lot of the Christian authorities didn't like. And so Jews got excluded from landholding. They were banned from holding land, or at least on a large scale. Would sort of force them to move into towns and force them to go into other areas of supporting themselves. So they became merchants, they became moneylenders, became professionals like physicians and butchers and, craft trades like that, but sort of pushed out of the agricultural economy where most of the wealth is. That in turn layered on top of the already existing religious tensions to give rise to anti-Semitism on an increased scale. Because there's, in monotheistic religions, a usury is considered a sin. Usury is the charging of interest on a loan. So Christians, Jews, and Muslims are all forbidden from committing usury against members of their own religion, which is to say, if you lent your fellow Jew or your fellow Christian or your fellow Muslim money, you weren't supposed to charge interest on the loan. Now that, makes it sort of a generous and charitable thing to do, to lend somebody money to help them through, but that doesn't give much incentive for a business loan, right? So as the merchants are becoming more active, they're wanting to raise capital and borrow money so they can, buy inventory or set up a business or buy a ship or something. They're not able to find business partners to borrow money from because they can't give them back interest on any money that they borrow. So what they do is they go to people of a different religion, right, which in Europe is mostly going to mean Jews. The Christian merchants are going to go to Jewish merchants or Jewish persons and borrow money from them because they can pay them interest, right? And this becomes a way to do it. The problem with that is that most people don't like owing people money. You may have been the one who wanted to borrow the money in the first place, but then when people come knocking on your door and maybe it's not good timing for you or something and they say time to pay up, people resent that. Most of you students probably are not very fond of your credit card companies or of your student loan companies that you owe so much money and so much interest to, right? So the sort of economic resentment piles on top of religious resentment, and the Jews wind up becoming at the receiving end of a lot of hostility. There's also a political dimension, which is that the kings are trying to get their power back. They need to finance that. They don't have enough power to tax their Christian subjects. The Christian subjects are revolt. King John deals with this in the early 1200s. Winds up with England getting the Magna Carta because he's trying to collect taxes, and the barons of England won't have it. They don't want to get taxed. But the Jews are a minority and they're pretty helpless. So you can tax the Jews all you want. So the Jews kind of become, sort of a financial resource for the kings to draw on. You need money, tax the Jews, squeeze the money out of them. Now, if you do that, how are the Jews going to come up with the money? Well, they're going to raise their interest rates on the loans that they make, assuming that these are Jews who are in money lending. What else are they going to do? How else are they going to come up with the money? So in a way, when the king taxes the Jews, the interest rates going up winds up sort of passing that taxation onto the rest of the population, which is a way for kings to kind of indirectly tax, the Christian population that they can't tax directly. So there's sort of a third layer. Then you get the religious, rivalries between Christianity and Judaism that can cause hostility. You get the economic dimension of people resenting Jewish money lending, and then there's a political dimension where if people want to protest the king's actions or put pressure on the king, but they don't feel strong enough or justified and able to justify doing it directly, feel like it could be insubordinate or something, they can indirectly put the pressure back on the king by attacking the king's Jews, right? Because the Jews are all sort of linked under the king's jurisdiction that way. So you'd get, especially associated with crusading, with other things, you start getting this sort of environment that becomes increasingly hostile towards Jews, generally. Now, bear in mind, you're not having massacres every year. There are massacre events, these catastrophic outbreaks of violence against the Jewish community. You get a lot of slow-burning, routine, kind of ritualized violence. There's still a lot of toleration and a lot of people, just doing business on a day-to-day basis over the course of a year that doesn't do that. But this sort of puts the Jews in a very awkward and difficult position in European society, and that's a final factor there. Okay, so that's by way of giving you a portrait of the High Middle Ages, the rise of knighthood, as chief feature of noble culture in a period of weak kingship, changes in the church with big reforms going on in the monasteries, the rise of the papacy trying to push through church reform in the secular church, also the university culture arising in scholasticism, and then also among commoners, the rise of trade, the rise of commerce, the rise of towns, merchants becoming a class, which is going to start playing more and more of a political and economic role in society. And along with that, this sort of very, very tense and sometimes violent situation as Christian society deals with its Jewish minority. These sort of helps give a bit of the major themes of what's going on in the High Middle Ages in Europe. Thank you very much, and see you at the next class.